Hi, everyone, and welcome to this second episode of Supply Chain Talk. My name is Duncan Brock, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to host this discussion. As I said, it's a discussion, there's no presentations, it's just an opportunity for us all to talk about topical issues in supply chain. And today's theme is all about ethical supply chains. And we're going to take some time to talk to a couple of experts about their thoughts, their insights, their views about what that means to them and what they're seeing in terms of examples of ethical supply chains and the impacts around that. So welcome to you all. As hopefully, if you're on the platform now, you can see that there is a chat function. So please do use that to raise any comments, ask any questions, or to raise any comments that you want about what we're saying. But there's a Q&A as well. So if you want specific questions you want to ask to me or to either of the speakers we've got today, the guests, then please do so, and I'll be very happy to add those as we go through. So that should be great. I'm actually coming to you from a basement meeting room in London today in a hotel. I've had the pleasure of a couple of face-to-face meetings, which you don't have every day at the moment, and we have our awards evening tonight. It's an Excellence in Procurement Awards that SIPS hosts every year, and we're delighted to be able to do that in one of the big hotels in London this evening. So it's great to be able to come here and actually still to be able to run this effectively as well. So I don't have my dinner jacket on yet, I don't have my black tie, but they'll be on later on for the great celebration of excellence in procurement and supply chain, which we'll have later on this evening. So really looking forward to that. So the way that Supply Chain Talk works is we've got a couple of guests that will come and join us, but also we on the topic of ethical supply chain, but also we try and choose a topical news story to actually bring into the conversation every week as well. And the one we're going to touch on today is around the CO2 shortage in the UK that was sort of coming and really has changed rapidly over the last 24 hours. So I want to get into that news article, but just before we do, maybe if I can introduce my first guest. The first guest is Natalie Ritchie from National Grid. So Natalie, welcome to you. Thanks for joining this session today. What we'd like to do, maybe Natalie, just before we go into the news story, maybe a quick introduction to yourself. I've said you're with National Grid, but maybe explain your role and what you do there.
Yeah, so thanks, Duncan. So as we've said, Natalie Ritchie, I work for National Grid. I'm the supply chain sustainability manager there. I work within our procurement function. So I manage all of the aspects around sustainability, social, economic, and environmental. So the ethics piece is obviously at the heart of that. I've been at National Grid for almost 5 years. So prior to that, I worked for Cadbury, which is now Mondelez. So still in the sustainability, ethical sourcing agenda, but obviously in a very, very different industry. So hopefully I can bring some of that knowledge to bear in the discussion today.
Yeah, well, so thanks for that, Natalie, and welcome to this. So let's come to this sort of news story because it's quite an interesting one, and certainly when it first broke, which was the fact that we were going to be shortage of carbon dioxide. I was thinking, well, how does high gas prices affect a shortage of carbon dioxide? But it was really interesting when you got into the story and you saw that CT Industries was saying that, well, it's uneconomic to produce the fertilizer, and because we can't produce the fertilizer, then the carbon dioxide is a byproduct of that, and therefore there was going to be a shortage. And it's for me, it's another example of the supply chain, the fact that there's unintended links in the supply chain all the way through. Who knew that CO2 production was linked to the production of fertilizer? And I think just that sense of, do we understand all these links in the chain is part of, I think, of the story for me. The fact that the government's had to step in, I think, is also part of the story, which is the fact that now the government's trying to provide subsidies to keep the CO2 production going. But I suppose if you're in a meat production plant, or if you're supplying frozen foods, you maybe also didn't understand how vulnerable that supply chain was. So I think there's quite an interesting mix of dynamics there. I don't know, when we were having a chat yesterday in preparation for this, you're also saying that you yourself in National Grid have your own supply chain challenges in terms of impact and disruption to supply. But I mean, what's your take on the I suppose the fragility of some of these supply chains that maybe we're not fully aware of at times, and those unintended links along the piece.
Yeah, I think to your point, I think that ripple effect has really shocked everyone in terms of, that the issue around carbon dioxide. And I've sort of looked into it and heard it on the news over the last few days in terms of all the implications from, the food and beverages industry who use carbon dioxide. I think the key point to this was that one manufacturer supplying over 50% of the carbon dioxide into those industries, and people probably not realizing that squeeze point could happen with that one factory, stopping production and then impacting a whole range of industries, food, pharmaceuticals, hospitals. And I think it was getting to that real crisis point when the government had to step in yesterday to make sure that production got back into play. But just hearing on the news today, there's a 3-day time lag now, which will have massive repercussions. 3 days doesn't sound like a lot, but the impact of that down into those different tiers of the different industries is huge. So I think from our perspective in National Grid, when I joined National Grid and I came from the food sector, I very much wanted us to look more at that supply chain mapping, look at that continuity of supply element. And I was looking at it very much from an ethical supply chain angle. And it was really, to be totally frank, sort of pushed back at the time. I think what has been recognized with Brexit, with everything that's happened with COVID, is that we need to know our supply chains much, much better and know where those squeeze points happen. And if something falls down, that it can trickle up very quickly into your own business. So in a way, I've sort of piggybacked on that continuity of supply aspect, trying to sort of overlay the ethics piece to say, well, if you know your supply chains, you also know not just the supply chain continuity piece, but also the ethical side of things as well. So I think there's a really close correlation between the two.
Yeah, and I think just listening to what you're saying there, and you probably saw it when you were at Cadbury's as well, it's also you're dealing with in a market where there's a lot of other customers as well. And you maybe don't, I mean, again, I'll come back to it. If I was in processing food and using CO2, did I actually realize how many other customers there were around for CO2? And almost like who would take priority? If you're supplying CO2, where would you do it? Would you supply the hospitals and supporting sort of that side of it, or would you support pig production, or would you support cheese production? And probably that decision that understanding of that market dynamic, as you said, your supply chain mapping, but it's not just your supply chain; it's who else is impacting that supply chain as well.
I think so. I think what's really interesting is that, as you say, you can be dealing with first tier suppliers who then might go to a much narrower second tier of supply, and who has priority over who. And I think that then comes down to the relationships that you have and the contracts that you have, and how much work have you put in play to make sure you might have alternatives. Often, in this case, there's very limited alternatives, but do you have that contingency in place to support that agenda, which is really, really key.
Yeah, and I suppose you also think, well, actually, that's just a commodity. I'm sure everyone can, CO2 should be freely available, and it's not. And I suppose, you work for National Grid, and I suppose we also take the same view of electricity is available, and then you suddenly find that there's a problem with a substation. Is it in Kent and sort of
I think
from France?
Exactly. So we've been in the news, I think, of the last week with a fire in a substation that will have implications for a number of months in terms of, that source of supply coming into the country. So I know there's a lot of work going on around that, and I'm not in the operational side, but there are those repercussions. Procurement have got involved, looking at alternatives and how we can bring other things into play to make sure that, as the strapline is in National Grid, we keep the lights on and the gas flowing for the consumer. And that's ultimately what people want, that seamless source of supply, be it electricity or be it food. And either way, if there are those pinch points, it can impact on cost and impact on day-to-day life for people as well. So I think people are starting to see those implications a lot more now in their day-to-day activities, really, which is interesting.
It is interesting, and it's probably, you say, trying to keep the lights on, but then there's a cost associated, isn't there? I mean, fundamentally, that's the inflationary pressures coming through that we're starting to see feed through all sectors. And I suppose the gas price hike is one of those, but we're probably going to see others coming through as well because of the different changes in the marketplace. And I think there's a great comment, I think, just coming from Trudy about lots of pressure for suppliers deciding who to supply when there's constant change. That's probably a good example of, as a supplier, who's my prime customer, who do I support best, and where do I decide on if I have to allocate, where I allocate my supplies.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So thanks for that, Natalie. Let me bring in the second guest. We've got Nina Nurjama joining us from Neste, and welcome to you. I think coming from Helsinki, so
That's
it's
right.
great to have you two with us as well, Nina. So let me give you an opportunity to maybe introduce yourself and Neste, because I knew a little bit about them. I've looked up a lot more since I knew you were going to be talking to us. But maybe a quick introduction to you, your role, and what Neste do as well.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So hi all. Nina Norjama is my name, and I work as head of human rights at Neste. Neste is world's largest producer of renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel. We are headquartered in Finland, but we do have refineries besides Finland also in Singapore and in Rotterdam. And as head of human rights, I'm based in the sustainability team, but I really do work closely with our supply chain development and sustainability teams. That is main focus of my work. So our most salient human rights issues are within the supply chains. And before joining Neste, I worked 20 years at another Finnish company, UPM, a global player in the forest industry, and was focusing on social responsibility and responsible sourcing there as well.
Thank you, Nina, and welcome. And before we move on to the discussions around ethical supply chains, and obviously, head of human rights you've got a real focus on that. But let me just come back to this whole point of, I suppose, the supply chain, and you're into renewables, but you're very much reliant on, I suppose, production in other sectors, and to get the commodities flowing through to produce the renewables. I mean, you must be exposed, as any organization is, to those vagaries of consumption and production. I mean,
sure.
Do you see a very similar situation about trying to balance things out effectively?
Yeah, of course. And what actually then strikes me the most here within the CO2 shortage is that actually all these disruptions we see in the supply chain, and actually that are getting more and more common every day, it's not only about the risk on businesses and on our operations, it's also at the same time risk on people. So the workers being impacted in the supply chains. So always when there is a production shutdown due to lack of raw materials, or so it's a worker somewhere who is then having a risk of delayed payments, or no payment at all, or being temporarily laid off, or putting people more into more vulnerable position, more at risk to modern slavery, for example, and we see that as an increased risk level in our supply chains.
Right. So what you're saying there is that there's disruption, and again, probably we don't think about this, that disruption is going to affect production, is going to affect people's livelihoods because of factory shutdowns or lack of payments down through the supply chain. So I think that's a really good example. We probably saw very similar. I was thinking back through to when the pandemic first hit, and ships not being allowed into ports, and people basically, workers having to stay on ships and not being able to get off the ships, but also not being paid, and sort of cocooned in there. That was another consequence, wasn't it, of disruption that was affecting people's livelihoods.
Exactly. Yeah.
So let's move on and let's talk about sort of ethical supply chain, because that's the main topic of this. And I think when we look at the challenges we have around this, and I look at the issues, I suppose one of the first ones, and maybe Nina, you've already touched on it, is where do you start? If you're looking at your supply chain, how do you identify where these ethical problems are likely to be? How do you understand where you're exposed? I suppose your supplier base is exposed to these challenges of ethics and ethical risks. And maybe Nina, I'm going to start with you. I mean, where do you start? Where do you look first?
Well, I think actually what Natalie mentioned already earlier, it's all about knowing the chain and knowing what you're purchasing. So I would say 2 points. Know the product you are purchasing, know the value chain, and then know the environment, the country where it comes from. So looking into the commodity risks, we do know the different ethical risks associated with different types of industries, so value chains. And then we also have lots of data available on the ethical risks in different countries. And so combining those facts together. And then finally, the third element coming on to the supplier level. So knowing the counterparty and yes, pulling the facts together.
Yeah. I mean, you say quite, I'll just map your supply chain. I think in my experience, that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, is there a, I don't know, do you have a toolkit that you use? Is there an approach to it? Do you have a big map on the wall where you draw things on? I mean, how do you go about really mapping out that supply chain to identify the risks in the way that you're just mentioning there?
Yeah, well, at Neste we have had quite a strong focus on the renewable feedstocks that we use, and actually there our approach has been quite manual and quite traditional. So having a team of experts dedicated on communicating with the suppliers. So we have roughly 500 suppliers of renewable feedstocks, and there we really focus on that before onboarding them, we basically send them questionnaires, we assess them in the very early phase, and we also collect data on so really track the raw material down to the origin. So, and we can do this at the moment with the limited number of feedstocks, limited number of suppliers. In my earlier work, when working in the forest industry, companies could have in Finland, for example, tens of thousands private forest owners in their supply chains. Of course, it's fully impossible to start sending questionnaires here and there. Luckily, then in the forest industry, you have the forest certification and the certification schemes that offer you the traceability through different chain of custody systems. So different tool sets for different types of supply chains.
Yeah, I maybe Natalie, bring you in here. I mean, you said, I think you said there wasn't maybe much appetite for doing the supply chain mapping initially, but there's a lot more now. So how do you go about mapping out your supply chains and looking for those risks and the issues down through them?
Yeah, I guess there are two angles to the work at National Grid, because National Grid is effectively like a large construction company. We build infrastructure in the UK and the US. So there are two angles to this. There's the on-site construction aspect, which is primarily in the UK and the US. And we used quite a bespoke model around that, looking at, who do we work with? So we do a lot of our work through large tier 1 contractors. So we'd look at, the complexity of the supply chain, first of all, in terms of how much subcontracting was going on, because the more subcontracting, the more difficult that would be and the more potential issues that could be down the supply chain. And then the type of work being done. So I think one of the challenges we had initially within National Grid was getting away from that thought of it just being sort of technical roles, highly paid, highly skilled roles that were doing the jobs for National Grid, and thinking about those elements further down the supply chain. So it could be, even the caterers, the cleaners, the security staff, the people doing the grounds work before that high engineering piece of work was being done. So we tried to sort of identify the hotspots from that perspective. From the goods side of things, again, we've had to work very closely with our main contractors to do some of that mapping. So we've looked at, for example, I'll bring grounds work into it as well, and looked at mapping right down to the quarry level and where the stone is coming from, and mapping that out within, collaboration with our main contractors, because we're very much reliant on them. Looking at things like, there's these huge T pylons that have been in the news recently that are being put in place in Hinckley in a big infrastructure project there. Where does that steel come from? Again, very much doing that work with the contractor and mapping that out. So for us, it's been very much on a case by case basis, and where are those, big ticket items, because we definitely haven't got the resource or the capability to do it on every single item that we're working on. So we look at T pylons, our big substation equipment, our overhead lines and cables. So what is really material to National Grid, and trying to do some mapping in those key areas where there could be potential issues, and to Nina's point, from origins that are potentially higher risk that we know are in the supply chain.
And it sounds like for both of you, it's building up that knowledge over time, isn't it? It's looking for, inherent knowledge. Yes, it's some data, but actually it's just understanding this is where I've got to look a bit further here because of those issues that's coming through. And actually, there's a question coming from James Smith about, if you discover unethical behaviour, how will you remedy it? I'm going to come back to that question in a few minutes, actually, James. So thanks for that question, because I think that's something that we do want to come on to. But before we go there, so we talk about mapping the supply chain. And Nina, I'm going to come back to you, because you also said you've got lots of data sources. So where do you look for this information on your suppliers? What sort of data feeds do you take? Because I know for a lot of people, okay, I might identify a risk, but how do I know? How do I know what's going on in that supply chain? What data can I use and feed in? So what sort of data sources do you use?
Yeah, we are using a provider for giving us the country risk data. There are different providers for that. Then for the counterparty risk, we use again different providers. That is actually pretty much focused on the compliance topics, and the taken care of by the our counterparty risk team in the compliance. However, often those tools, they also include different news watches, and actually those can be pretty useful, not necessarily, but they also can provide good insight into those suppliers that you don't yet know anything about. So but yeah, I agree with you, Duncan, what you said, that it's also about building your own data. And I do think that also for us sustainability experts who are not part of the sourcing organization, even though we work really closely with them, for us it's also important to know the suppliers and to interact with them and learn about the different value chains and the dynamics in them. And I fully agree with Natalie's point on the understanding the complexity and how the different pieces are tied in together.
Right. And you say, I mean, it's data feeds, it's news feeds, it's all sorts of, it's lots of different sources of information. I know some organizations have gone very much to try and find one company who can provide them with all that data in one place. Have you found that company? or is it that you've really got to sort of look in all different types of places to gather the information that you need?
No, yeah, you can also give me a hint when there is this one single company, so I would like to use that.
Okay. I mean, Natalie, what's your
thought? Yeah,
thought?
just to add, I mean, it's a very competitive landscape, isn't it, at the moment, in terms of people trying to sell solutions around sustainability dashboards, and we haven't gone that far yet. It's definitely something that we're looking at, because we need that, one touch of a button where we can, if an issue arises, that we can go into a system and have all of that data in one point. At the moment, we've got a number of different solutions. So we work with CDP on the environmental side. We work with risk methods on some of the continuity of supply, be that financial risk or single source risk or whatever. We've got spreadsheets. So we've got at the moment quite a complex landscape internally to pull all of that information into one place. And I think that will be the next step, that we'll try and identify a solution. I mean, I get calls every day around solutions that we could go with, and it's trying to sort of think about what will work best for us at the moment. So we're going through that process currently, because it is, it is a challenge to try and have that information at our fingertips, and build up that knowledge, to your point, Duncan, and keep the history of that, because a lot of our data sources are historical data of what has already happened. It's like, how do we assess that future potential risk that may happen? And it's trying to pull that information in and get real good visibility around that.
Yeah. And there's a really good comment just coming from Trudy, which I suppose adds to that, which is, it must be quite a costly and difficult task to map the supply chains. I suppose if you're under pressure on cost, how do you, I'm not saying how do you justify your jobs, because that'd be the wrong question, but how do you make sure that you have the resources, the people, I suppose the cost of these sort of databases when you need them? How do you make sure that your businesses continue to make sure you have those available for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I think it's a challenge, and the fact that we haven't got that one solution currently is probably testament to that, because people are trying to balance that efficiency aspect, especially in a procurement function where, efficiency is still the key focus. But I think there is that recognition now that is needed, but it's trying to have a pragmatic approach to it. So, to Trudy's point, it's not mapping every single element in our supply chain, but what are the really material things for us that we should know more about, that there could be those really key issues that you'd want to address if something, did happen in a key supply chain to us. So it's trying to think about it from as I said, from a materiality point of view, and look at the ones that we really want to focus on, not trying to boil the ocean and look at every single element in our supply chain. So it's, where are those potential risks and how can we best mitigate those risks? And especially from an ethical perspective, it's trying to get people to think about where could those hotspots be, and think beyond just, to Nina's point, the first tier of our supply chain, but beyond that, and where could those real issues come to bite us potentially, and what could we do to mitigate that and make sure it doesn't happen? So I think it's looking at it from that perspective.
And I suppose also, I'll come to you in a minute, Nina, but is it also that it's not just your job, that actually it's the job of anyone in procurement to be taking this into account and thinking about it and understanding it, and that's maybe a skill set that traditional procurement people haven't had, because you're trying to think of longer term consequences rather than just a short term sourcing exercise.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, and a lot of the work I've done over the time I've been in National Grid is about embedding that relevancy thinking into the procurement process, right from the category strategy all the way through. And I think where it sometimes falls down into the contract management. So I think where procurement are challenged a lot, or there's a bit of pushback, you ask for everything in a contract, in a tender, do you actually then manage it into the contract delivery? And I think that's where we're really trying to make a shift now, that we've got our code of conduct, we've got our terms and conditions. Do we actually make that live and breathe into the contract, and make sure that people are thinking about the potential, especially ethical risks, on a project level and on a day-to-day basis? So it's not just a policy tick box exercise.
Yeah. What's your view on this, Nina? I mean, obviously you've been appointed into your role as head of human rights, so your organisation must be very committed to this as an initiative. But how, let's come back to this investment. How do you make sure that as an organisation you continue to invest in this area, so that you do understand, and also you can mitigate and offset these risks?
Well, in our case, when the products that we sell are based on, or the value add of the products what our company sell is sustainability. So right. Sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel. So the product is all about being sustainable and responsibly produced. So in that sense, there is basically no question or it's not being challenged that we use a lot of resources to ensure that the supply base is really sustainable. But yes, it's it needs to be risk-based job also, and focus on the material issues. So even though within direct sourcing we would be able to check currently each and every supplier and really actually the further tiers, when we go to indirect, we also have several thousands of suppliers, and it's impossible to have the same type of approach there. So really then applying the same principles as Natalie was explaining when it comes to construction, for example, is what we apply there.
Yeah, and as you say, it's looking where you really need to look, isn't it? And also knowing where actually, you know what, it's quite transparent here and I'm okay at the moment. So I mean, I think linked to both of those. So one thing's identifying the risk. We talked about the data and getting the information through and starting to do the risk analysis. What do you do when you find there's a problem? And I'll maybe come to you first, Nina. I mean, in terms of human rights issues, problems with modern slavery, child labour, whatever it would be, workers not being paid. What's the best approach in trying to tackle those issues when you find them?
Well, I think the first step is to create the understanding or create the awareness and the understanding. So when pointing out that in our opinion here is a non-conformancy, get the supplier to agree on that. Often it is so. Sometimes it's not always. So get the understanding that we do have here a gap that we need to work on. And I would say the precondition then for the continuation is that the supplier is both willing and able to do something. If it's something really, there is a tremendous lack related to fire safety caused by poor machinery or something that would really then require investments from the supplier, even though they would be very willing to correct. If they then don't have the financial stability to do that, then it doesn't help either. So have the supplier willing to correct the gaps and be able to do that, and follow up, monitor, ensure that the corrective action is closed.
So, do you rely on the? I think it was mentioned about having the terms and conditions in the contract. I mean, do you use the contract lever, or do you do it much more on the basis of you've got to solve this for us? But almost like regardless of what's in the contract, this is just an imperative that you've got to focus on and do something about it.
Yeah, well, yeah, for sure. We do have our supplier code of conduct. It is part of so setting the minimum requirements towards all of our suppliers, be it then direct or indirect. It's included in the contracts. We after the or in addition to the assessments we also do supplier audits, and if then noticing any gaps, so then it's about having the corrective action plans in place and closing those.
Right, but I mean, there's often this sort of sense that, okay, you find a problem, in which case stop using that supplier and go and use a different supplier. But I mean, I think everything we've learned in this space is that's not the right answer, is it? I mean, actually, that's even worse for the workers associated, because suddenly they've got no jobs, rather than working with a supplier to address any issues that's there. I mean, is that the approach you take?
So yeah, from the human rights angle, cutting and running is the worst thing to do. So I think the best what we can do with our actions is to help the suppliers to develop, and that is also the way that we really can then we can reach the positive impact, and we can contribute to have positive outcomes on people. So
right, so it's really working with the suppliers, encouraging them. Sometimes it's an education process for them as well, isn't it? That they need to understand that there is a problem here, and they may not be fully aware of the implications of it. So, I mean, Natalie, let's bring you in here. What's your experience in this space in terms of what you do when you find these issues, or what should you do when you find these issues?
I think, I had quite a different angle on this because I came from the food sector into a very different industry in construction. So I'd come from a sector where auditing had been, pretty much the standard practice in terms of looking at manufacturing sites and going down to origin even and doing a lot of audits. I think, especially from an ethical, and if you go to the extreme, the modern slavery piece, audits will not necessarily find those issues because people are quite sophisticated in terms of hiding, the issues that could be taking place and covering their tracks, if you like. So I think when I came into National Grid and more of a very different sector on construction, the approach we very much took was around supplier engagement, awareness building, communication, talking to suppliers, and being hopefully more humble in terms of we can learn as much from you as we know, and trying to do it in a two-way dialogue really with a lot of especially some of our main contractors who were probably further along the journey than National Grid were at the time. So really trying to sort of build on that knowledge and develop things in a two-way approach. And interestingly, we haven't found issues of modern slavery, and I often try and position it not in the modern slavery context, but in that ethical supply chains or decent work or, that exploitation spectrum, not modern slavery per se. So thinking about just worker conditions, are they being paid correctly? Have they got the right working hours in place, the right health and safety? And trying to get people to think of it from that angle, because we do find issues of excessive working hours. We do find issues of right to work checks not being done properly. And those could be potential triggers to worse issues. So it's trying to get people to think about it from that perspective and have that understanding. So we've definitely done it on hopefully a collaborative engagement approach rather than a compliance audit approach, I would say.
Right. Yeah. Sorry, Nina, go on.
Yeah, just wanted to add on that yes, I do fully agree, and we have been focusing also a lot on supplier awareness and engagement, especially in high-risk countries like Malaysia and in Indonesia. Perhaps third element that I would like to add is that especially when looking at in really high-risk countries where we have more systemic human rights issues, so then look for opportunities to do things in partnerships with other companies and drive collaborative action. Often, it's not a single company who can really then solve the issue there, but we need to join our forces and drive things together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just add to that, in the food sector that I came from, it was definitely trying to join partnerships, be that, soy or palm oil or cocoa initiatives, and trying to do it collaboratively at an industry level. There's still certain things you have to engage on directly, but now in the sector I'm in utilities, we're trying to look at that collaborative model, and it's that common voice thing I think is really, really strong. So if you've got 10 client organizations all saying the same thing, all asking for the same thing, and all trying to communicate and work on the same agenda, it resonates, in procurement, we're in a unique position that the contractors I work with will often say, tell us what you want us to do and we'll do it. We want to work with you. So you can use that influence to make things happen. And I think we don't often use that leverage in procurement in the positive way that we can. And it's trying to sort of push that agenda more from we want to work together on this, and we're all trying to sort of aim towards the good intent, really.
I suppose just as Trudy's been great today. She's just asked another question. She sort of said, what's the stronger driver to increase ethical behaviour in business? So if you want, what's the driver? She says, is it consumer choice or legislation as being the stronger driver to make changes? Because obviously there's lots of regulations around, but actually, I suppose for both of you, really, what do you see as being the best way of driving this through, both in your business, but also I'll come back to what you just said there, Natalie, in terms of the common voice. If there's a common voice going down from the customers, consumers through to the customers, through to suppliers, then is that a better way of driving change? I'm just interested in your views.
Yeah, I'm happy to go, but I think I've had it from both angles. So at Cadbury, it was very much the consumer was driving or expected an ethical product. So you had that brand piece. Where I work now, you haven't really got a brand. Who knows really what National Grid does? That's an expectation that the electricity flows into your home. Our customer in that regard is the regulator, Ofgem, or some of the customers that we work with. So some of the drivers have been regulatory, but I would say Ofgem as a regulator is more focused on the environmental agenda than maybe I shouldn't say this, but the social economic side. I think that's changing. For us, it's often the investors. So the investors are starting to ask questions around this. So that drives it. On the human rights piece, I think the modern slavery legislation did drive a lot of initial action, and I think was a good thing to really sort of create that level playing field. So it's a real mix of things. And at the end of the day, for us now, it's about being a responsible business. So I think a lot of companies are setting out their charters around being ethical businesses, and there is that external expectation that it's done. I hope it becomes just a matter of course and a standard requirement for any business that they have this as part of their offering for the work that they do. But it does differ in terms of whether you're brand related or not. But I think just to add, I don't think you can wait for consumers to drive this. I think you've got to really sort of deliver it as a business yourself.
Yeah, and Nina, I mean, I think you set off by saying, though, in your business, this is part of your, this is what your business is about renewables. That's what you market, and that's, I suppose, ultimately that is your driver, is it? That if you don't do this, then you won't have a business. Yeah,
it is, and but I agree with Natalie. All the different drivers, they are there. So it's the large brands who are driving this. We are also actually part of their supply chain. Sometimes consumers, but I wouldn't dare trust them too much either. Yes, investors definitely. We see that coming, and regulation, and we see that as positive. So we are welcoming the development of mandatory human rights due diligence on European level. We do think it would help to create even more level playing field for assessing human rights risks. And
right. So sometimes you do need the stick. Sometimes you do say to people, not like, wouldn't it be nice if you do it, but actually you have to do it.
It's an interesting one. National Grid is very compliance driven, so they do like, if there's regulation, they will follow it to the letter. So that does drive part of the agenda for sure.
Yeah, I've actually just got and maybe you're building on that. Sort of, Maurice has just said there must be businesses whose drivers are consumer-led rather than compliance investors. Why is there such a negative view towards consumer-led drivers? So maybe that's slightly different. I'm not sure it's a negative view, but I think you just actually go on.
I was just going to say it's definitely not a negative view. I think consumers just expect it, and they're not going to challenge you around it. I think it's just a baseline expectation that you will act ethically. Right. So I don't think it's an additional driver as such. I think it's just a given from the consumer side.
Okay. So thanks for that comment, Maurice. So I think any final comments, Natalie and Nina, before we wrap this one up? I think it's been really interesting, and it's been great to get both of your insights. I think we covered off all the topics that we said we're going to cover in this session. Any final comments from either of you? apart from just get on with this?
No, I think from my perspective, it is. I think the key thing is that, you know, materiality, understand where your potential risks are, especially from the ethics piece. And I think it all, you know, we can narrow it down onto the ethical side, but it also cuts across in terms of the environmental agenda, the social agenda. I think the whole of sustainability is a really key thing that any business needs to look for and think about that wider impact that you can have as a business in terms of that positive, you know, we talk about positive societal impact, really think about it from that perspective. So not just managing risk, but thinking about the positive angle as well.
Yeah, thank you. Nina, final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I would also highlight the integration. So not to keep sustainability separated from the total quality or your sourcing approach, but really have it as an integral part when you evaluate the suppliers, when you look at their performance and focus on development.
Brilliant, thank you. So Nina, Natalie, I really appreciate your time today. It's been an excellent discussion. You've had lots of really good inputs and insights and perspectives there. I've learned a lot, and hopefully everyone who's been listening to this and watching this has also learned it as well. So Natalie, Nina, really appreciate your time today. Thank you both for your inputs. And just quick plug for the next episode that's coming up same time next week. It's on sustainable supply chain. How the pandemic has tested and strengthened its links with business. So I think it's going to be really interesting just to sort of see, you know, building on this theme. We focus more on ethical supply chains here, but actually they're looking a lot more into the sort of sustainability and the issues. And, you know, we know COP26 is coming up soon, and there's going to be a lot of initial discussions around that. So looking forward to that session. I think my colleague Sam is going to be hosting that one. So look forward to that. But in the meantime, Natalie, Nina, thank you very much. And everyone, thank you for tuning in and for listening to this episode of Supply Chain Talk. Thank you.